corpses were left to rot in a summer sun, it didn't matter whether these stories were true. They were believed, passed around the country with a devotion that bordered on religious submission. But after the decree, fear, for a moment, subsided. Crowds looking for family members or old friends surged past the straggling eucalyptus and palm trees toward the prison's towering cinder block walls. They overwhelmed the beleaguered guards, then stampeded through hulking iron gate after hulking iron gate into the prison courtyard, a dusty expanse bordered by a 40-foot-long wall, 2 stories high, of fetid garbage. A scalding sun, its heat putrefying, deepened the stench. We followed the crowds forcing their way through each gate, deeper and deeper inside the prison. Heading the other way were newly freed prisoners. After the amnesty was announced, Iraqi officials at the prison, as bewildered as we were, had told us that 500 inmates would be released every hour. But as word of freedom spread, a stampede erupted inside the cell block walls, and the prisoners surged out. So violent was the crush that some were trampled to death at the very moment of their liberation. Those who emerged alive before us wept, danced, or staggered literally into an unfamiliar world. They hurried as fast as they could. These were unpredictable times, and to everyone, the event felt more like a prison break than a planned release. In waiting buses, prisoners blew kisses and threw their hands upward in gestures to heaven. I remember the words of one especially jubilant inmate. "Sheer joy, that's all I feel. Sheer joy," said Muhammad Kadam Aboud, a 45-year-old father of 3 who had been jailed a year for stealing. "I'll join my family, I'll see my kids, I'll talk all night." He smiled, then added, "When the party finishes, I'll sleep." Before us, other prisoners performed as they thought necessary. "With our spirit, with our blood, we will sacrifice for you, Saddam," some cried as they thanked God and the dictator in the same breath. "Yes, yes, to the leader Saddam," shouted others. Volleys of celebratory gunfire echoed through the din of celebration, with young men playing drums, blowing trumpets, and waving their shirts underneath the abundant portraits of Saddam. Impromptu markets grew up, as they do wherever crowds gather. As night fell, traffic was jammed for miles along the main road, and then, no less quickly, jubilation turned to grief, and grief turned to anguish. Fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, and cousins searched in vain in the darkness for relatives they had expected to be among the freed. They called out names, but often the pleas were futile. Many of the missing were, despite the family's desperate hope, long dead. Some searchers held handwritten signs in the streaming headlights of cars. There were moments of recognition, the names legible in the random flashes of light, the sloping cursive of desperate Arabic, momentarily decipherable. But then the names would fade back into the enveloping dark, returning to anonymity in the long curse of the dictator's wrath. As I left Abu Ghraib that night, hitching a ride to Baghdad, so many names passed before the windshield of the car in which I traveled that I soon lost count. In Iraq, only Saddam could bring down what he had built with a few lines of text read on radio and television. But as the events at Abu Ghraib unfolded, it became clear that Saddam's diktat had given rise to an element of subversion. For the first time, people were standing up, demanding to know what had happened to their unaccounted-for sons, husbands, and family members. The combustible ambiguities of Iraq, the ancient pride, the desire for justice, the resilience, were emerging from beneath the fear, conformity, and silence after so many years. 2 days after the jail release, more surprising rebellion burst forth in a crowded parking lot outside the drab information ministry, along one of Baghdad's busiest streets. "I don't know where he is," one elderly woman wailed to me, her hands flailing. "I don't know whether he is alive. I don't know whether he is dead." I never learned her name, or whom she had lost, nor did I see her again. But dressed in her black abaya, her mere presence here endangering her life, she revealed the depth of anger lurking beneath what had for so long been controlled. How many Iraqis bore such emotions behind their careful countenances, I wondered. Dozens of protesters, women in black, young men in street clothes, gathered at the ministry's bunker-like building near the Tigris, demanding to know why their relatives had not been among those freed on the day of liberation. It was a show of strength. It was a demand for accountability. Some of their relatives might have been among those whose names I had seen written on placards outside Abu Ghraib. Most, if not all, had probably been executed. Secret police, some armed, fanned through the masses to disperse the people. After a handful of men and women forced their way into the Foreign Press Center, shots were fired into the air, scattering the protesters. But 2 hours later, the determined people returned. Their usual fear had been shattered by the circumstances. For the first time in years, words were spoken in public that rang with truth. One man pleaded to an official that he had not seen his brother since 1980. The official replied that the delay was just procedures, that he would still be set free. "No, everybody is gone," the man answered, shaking his head defiantly. "It's not procedures. There are no more procedures. We want information." The dam had broken. In time, the crowd broke up. I walked down the street, scared and excited. This was something none of the journalists in Iraq had seen before. What was playing out in Baghdad's streets was political, moving, and filled with an unpredictability that was both menacing and exhilarating. That same night, I saw my friend Wamid Navma, a political science professor who was one of the few those days in Baghdad who dared to speak his mind. Like many in the anxious and confused city, he was stunned by the open public outcry. There was life underneath what Saddam had wrought. Wamid was invigorated, full of pride. Saddam had not destroyed his citizens' spirit, their basic expectation of political fairness. Wamid spoke of justice, honor, and courage, qualities that meant much to him and historically to all Iraqis. To him, they were elements of politics as well as of principle. And that day they had motivated Iraqis, or at least some of them, to reclaim some sense of power over their own fates. A veteran of interrogation, he could usually hide his emotions, but not on this day. He paused for a minute, as if calculating the cost of his words, but the day's events propelled him forward, a little recklessly. Once people dare to speak their minds, he told me, more people will be encouraged to show their different views. Repression determined much of what happened in Iraq before the war, but the nearly absolute emphasis on the all-encompassing tyranny blinded many Americans to everything else that was there. Time and again, we envisioned, or were given, a simple, two-dimensional portrait of a country, waiting for aid and dreaming of freedom as it suffered under the unrelenting terror of a dictator. Iraq, we were told by our leaders in Washington and others, was trapped in a relationship of submission and victimization. Its people were voiceless, deprived of the power to determine their own destiny. Once the dictator was removed, by force if need be, Iraq would be free, a tabula rasa on which to build a new and different state. If we can change Iraq, George W. Bush and his determined lieutenants maintained, we can change the Arab world, so precariously adrift after decades of broken promises of progress and prosperity. This rhetoric, idealistic to Western ears, reminiscent of century-old colonialism to a third world audience, envisioned the dawn of a democratic and just Middle East, guided by a benevolent United States. For the Americans, aroused by fears of terrorism, Baghdad, the capital of the Arab world's potentially most powerful state, was the obvious choice for a place to begin a wave of democratic reform. This rationale for invasion ran at least as deep as the illusory warnings about weapons of mass destruction or the rhetoric emphasizing the tyranny of Saddam. Iraq was an instrument of change for the United States, a lever to pull, the first Middle Eastern domino to fall. But on the day of the amnesty at Abu Ghraib, I got a glimpse of tensions entrenched over decades, even centuries, by deep-seated grievances and the narrative of a complicated history. At that point, I started to realize how little any of us, journalists, policymakers, citizens, really understood about Iraq. Proud but humbled, rebellious but humiliated, the country was never simply a black-and-white photograph of dictatorship and repression. It was a time-worn sculpture, born of a distant past and weathered by more recent, wrenching events, and its people were more than victims. To start to understand Iraq, one must consider the legacy of Baghdad's medieval glory, a burst of brilliance followed by a long autumn of decline, along with the nation's wounds inflicted in more modern times. The war with Iran from 1980 to 1988, one of history's most savage conflicts, the decade-long period of international sanctions imposed after Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, Saddam's brutal rule. When the United States arrived, its soldiers, diplomats, and aid workers marched into an antique land built on layer upon layer of history, a terrain littered with wars, marked by scars, seething with grievances and ambitions. Willingly or not, they added their own chapter to this chronicle. The Americans came as liberators and became occupiers, but most important, they served as a catalyst for consequences they never foresaw. The U.S. experience in Iraq was a microcosm of America's broader struggle with the Arab world, a generational battle that has spun around axes of religion, culture, and identity, waged by two cultures so estranged that they cannot occupy the same place. Iraq was an unwilling participant, drafted into a fight that it did not solicit. The Americans brought a revolution without ambition and an upheaval without design. Liberation was the U.S. mantra, reiterated at every occasion. Iraqis hailed their new freedom, but quickly found themselves grappling with forces that had long remained subterranean. Even the Iraqis themselves did not